Thank you for joining us for the Lifelong Learning at Home series presented by the Laurier Association for Lifelong Learning. For over 20 years, the Laurier Association for Lifelong Learning has been offering unique adult learning opportunities on Laurier's Waterloo and Brantford campuses. Our non-credit courses are intended for personal interest and self-education. We're pleased to offer you this opportunity to learn from your own home and are excited to be joined today by Marcia Chaudet. Dr. Marcia Chaudet is an educational developer in teaching and learning at Wilfrid Laurier University. She's also a sessional instructor in Laurier's biology department and has taught a wide range of biology and science undergraduate courses. She received her PhD in science from the University of Waterloo and focused her research on the role of bacteria in human sugar digestion. Through her research and teachings in the sciences, she strives to invoke students' sense of curiosity in science and question the world of biology that surrounds them. Thank you for joining us today, Marcy. We will now turn it over to you for your lecture on evolutionary biology.
Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here today to share with you a discipline and an area of interest of mine in biology. And we're going to be looking at evolution. And through that, we're going to look at essentially what is evolution. You may have heard of the phrase of natural selection, and we'll talk about what natural selection is. And then we'll go through a couple areas of evidence that scientists have presented that support this theory of evolution, and particularly natural selection that we'll talk about. So nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. And so this is a quote by a theorist who was bringing forward the importance of the study of evolution. And so this was in the 70s, and this individual was discussing the importance of exploring evolution during a time when people didn't necessarily support some of these concepts. So in 1973, he wrote an essay, and this evolutionary biologist had this interesting area where he had creationism, and he also had this idea of theory of evolution. And he really pushed for the idea in particular that evolution is something that should be taught as part of the biology classroom, and that this is something that should be part of public education. But I really like this quote because if we think of biology and if we think of some of the species that are present in the world, some of them are quite obscure and very different. If we look at just the structure of them or the roles they play, you know, if we think of plants compared to animals, they're very distinct from one another, and it is kind of nonsensical if you look at them in comparison and try to understand the origin of those creatures, if you will. But if we think of it through the lens of evolution and the theories that we're going to talk about today, we start to understand why the things we observe in biology make sense and understand how they're related to one another. So what comes to mind when you think of evolution? This is a question that I think it's important to think about because I'm sure most of you have heard of the term evolution. Perhaps what comes to mind is Darwin. He's the father of evolution and some of the theories that we're going to be talking about. Perhaps it's this idea of some of the imagery of a whale kind of crawling out of the ocean and growing legs and being able to walk, or perhaps it's the evolution of man from apes. But the definition, the true definition of evolution is that evolution is the change in heritable characteristics of a biological population over successive generations. So that's a bit of a mouthful. So we're going to break that down a little bit and talk about what that exactly means. Now, I just want to also mention that when we're speaking about evolution, this is a theory that we're referring to. So evolution is a theory of how life evolved on Earth. Okay? But it's important to be mindful of the fact that with evolution, it doesn't specifically tell us you know, where life came from or how it began. So if we think of, you know, what was the specific recipe of molecules and chemicals that maybe collided, that created new bonds, that, you know, allowed a cell to form, which led to this idea of a life form. Evolution doesn't really address those specific questions and uncertainties around how life came to be, but rather evolution focused on what comes after that fact? So once we have the first organism or cell that existed on Earth, what happens after that? That's what evolution addresses. And so it also explores the idea of how do we also have species that evolve from other species? Why do we have such diversity on our planet of Earth? So if we look at this image here that's shown on the slide, this is just showing you some examples of some insects that Darwin observed during his studies. And evolution helps us to understand how do we have these differences in diversity that we see with these insects here, different patterns of the butterfly, different shapes, even different roles if we compare, let's say, a honeybee to a butterfly. So how do we have this biological diversity present and evolve over time? That's what evolution tries to address and answer some of those questions. So approaching evolution, we can look at it in a number of different ways. The first way is just simply comparing existing organisms that exist. So if I'm an evolutionary biologist right now and I want to better understand how a particular butterfly species evolved, I can look at existing butterfly species that I believe are related and compare those two species to one another. So I can compare them in their adult form, let's say as their emerged, fully grown adult butterfly. And I can compare their wing structure. I can look at their body structure, how they perform certain processes, so how they acquire food. Do they have certain physical features that allow them to acquire food? How do they adapt to predation? So do they have different features that allow them to hide from predators? But then I also can look at the different forms in their life cycle and compare those different stages with one another as well. So looking at, the initial stage of a caterpillar, if I look at that early stage, compare them with these two species, perhaps I can observe different observational features, different structures on them, and perhaps that can give me an indication that they are related, and this can help me better understand perhaps why the butterfly on the left evolved from the butterfly on the right. Another approach that you can take is to compare fossil records. So this is where we're looking at, say, existing fossils existing structure of a horse. So the top one shown in this figure. So that can be kind of what we're comparing to other fossil records. And I can look at the other three fossil records, and I would look at the overall structure of the horse. I can also look at the structure of the head, perhaps observing the size of the brain, as well as some of the other skeletal features. Let's say the shape or the length of the limbs can also give me an indication. And this can help me understand, what specific features evolved over time. And that's perhaps why we have horses with certain abilities. So if we look at, let's say, the right part of the image with the leg structure, we can see that hooves over time, starting from the bottom, with Mesohippus, evolved quite a different hoof structure over time. And we'll talk about, what pressures resulted in perhaps that type of physiological change in this particular horse species. Now, going back to that initial definition, let's look at that a little bit closer to help us understand what we're observing here. So evolution is looking at a change, so some sort of difference in the heritable characteristics. So when we're talking about heritable characteristics, what we're referring to is what we can actually observe with that species. So the term we use in biology is phenotype, and that's just the physiological or the physical aspect that we're observing. So perhaps with the cheetah, that could be the shape in its maybe its bone structure and its hind limbs that allow it to run fast. Giraffe, change in the length of the neck, it has this longer neck. Perhaps with the camel, some sort of change in the structure allowing it to have this hump for storage. So that would be the heritable characteristics, and that phenotype, as I said, comes from a change typically in the genetics, and that's called the genotype. So changes in the DNA result in changes in the physical observations we can make of these species. And so when it says biological populations, that's looking at, let's say, a cheetah population of a particular species, or a giraffe population, or a camel population of a particular species. And we'll talk about what this means in regards to over successive generations. But if we just look at that, really simply what it means is the change has to be carried through multiple generations. So as a parent, if I pass on a heritable change or characteristic to my offspring, to my child, they then have to continue to pass that on to continued generations in order to say that there has been an evolutionary event that has occurred. So when we're talking about evolution, sometimes if we look back at this slide, we sometimes think about, or more naturally, we think about animals or species that have these very prominent differences in their appearances, right? So the giraffe, it's really easy to think about, you know, it obviously evolved from a species with a shorter neck. Why did it evolve? We'll talk about that in a little bit. But when we think about these evolutionary changes across biological populations, we want to make sure that we reflect on the fact that these biological populations include all the species of organisms that we see on the planet. So this includes amphibians, insects, plants. We also need to consider, as this figure shows, the ones on the right that are kind of faded, ones that led to divergence. So in this figure, the ones on the right here that have this kind of highlighted coloring, this is where there was some distinct evolutionary event that resulted in the splitting of a species. So it's important for us to understand what species are those. Of course, we need to consider organisms or animals, species that have been extinct, right? So we talked about looking at fossil records, but then we also need to consider some of these species that are even too small for us to see with our own eyes. So we need to think about bacteria and how they've evolved, in some of these single cell organisms like yeast. What characteristics did they have? How did they evolve and lead to this transition of simple organisms of a single cell, let's say, to more complex multiple cellular organisms like we see with plants, insects, humans, mammals, right? So talking about heritable characteristics, let's talk about that a little bit in more detail. So in this example here, I have a mommy bunny and a daddy bunny, and they mate and they produce 3 offspring. They have a brown bunny, a black bunny, and a white bunny. So those are the changes in characteristics that we can observe for this particular species of bunny. And so these are heritable characteristics because they've inherited them from their parents, so the previous generation. Now, perhaps these bunnies live in an environment where there's snow. So let's say they live in the Arctic and they're surrounded by snow, and it actually is advantageous for this particular bunny to have a white color because it allows them to camouflage themselves from predators, let's say fox or wolves that are searching for them for a meal. So this bottom bunny, it then ends up mating and having 2 offspring that are also white. And then those bunnies, they end up mating and having 2 offspring that are subsequently also white. So what we see here is we have a heritable characteristic that was inherited that is then carried on through multiple generations. And as we'll talk about, this results in an important element to their survival and allows them to thrive in their environment. So again, if we think of the context of the Arctic and the snow, clearly the white bunnies would have a greater chance of survivability compared to this bunny's siblings of a black bunny and brown bunny. So that's what we're referring to when we're talking about a heritable characteristic. So the first thing that we're going to talk about in relation to kind of these evolutionary events is artificial selection. And really what this is what the name suggests. This is where you're selecting for a particular trait in an artificial type of way. And so this is a process in which humans are consciously selecting for or against a particular feature in an organism. So this is where, you know, a long time ago when we initially as humans started agriculture, we were able to see with subsequent breeding, there were certain lines of plants that would lead to more desired characteristics. Maybe they would produce more fruit or produce foliage that's more preferred. And so we were able to see that if we selected for those specific plants and subsequently use seeds from the plants that have the desired characteristics, this would then lead to subsequent generations with those desired traits. So here's two examples that are fairly well known. The one on the left is an interesting example. So this is where we have the plant wild mustard, and you may have seen this before, but this is one that grows quite well. It's kind of considered a weed, but particularly in the UK. And wild mustard, they found that if they observed certain traits and artificially selected, it led to us being able to grow cauliflower, broccoli, cabbage, kale, and kohlrabi, okay, as well Brussels sprouts. So if we think of any of those brassica type of vegetables that we're familiar with that we enjoy to this day, they all are derived originally from this wild mustard plant. And this is perhaps where a farmer noticed as they were growing this wild mustard, you know, if they, you know, grew it a certain way, or there was one plant that produced a different type of flower, and then they grew that particular plant, and over time we were able to artificially select for these preferred vegetables. Another example that you know, most of us are aware of is the idea that our domesticated pets of dogs are all derived from an original ancestor of a wolf, right? And so this is where they believe that there would have been you know, certain wolves that were maybe more docile, more friendly. They then took that in and then selectively kept breeding those, and then they found that certain generations had certain physical characteristics that they preferred. And again, thinking to what they would have been used for, not as pets necessarily, but you know, for herding or for hunting, let's say, then they would then continue to use those particular breeds to continue to select, to narrow down the traits that they have that were selected for the ones that they prefer. So we can also think about artificial selection in relation to selecting as well for traits that we want in relation to production of meat as well. So this figure on the right is showing you an image of artificial selection that's been done on chicken. So of course this is done on a much more purposeful level where we're genetically modifying these organisms, and that's also what we see with a lot of plants. I'm sure you've heard of genetically modified organisms. That's where we're artificially selecting. But here you can see in a very short period of time, because that's one thing that we're not really going to talk about today, but maybe worth mentioning, that evolution is a fairly slow event to occur, right? If we think about that tree that we'll talk a little bit more about, the tree of life, that looks at different changes in evolutionary events that lead to different species, that's actually a really slow process. It can take thousands of years for those new species to arise and maintain those characteristics that are passed on to successive generations. Where here we have an example in about 50 years where we've dramatically changed those characteristics, those physical features of this chicken. And this is just showing you through this selection process, we've dramatically changed the weight of the chicken, which relates to more meat on that bird, which produces more meat for us to eat, of course. So thinking about some of these things, I wanted to pose a question as to what are some consequences of this approach to selection. So, you know, thinking about our example of agriculture, you know, what happens when we start manipulating those populations and selecting and kind of trying to control this idea of evolution. I mean, the same thing when we think of these dogs, if we're artificially selecting for certain breeds. So I want you to think about that for a moment. So a couple of things that you maybe came up with. If you have a dog, you probably are familiar with the fact that the place we're in now with some of these purebred dogs is that we've narrowed the genetic pool, if you will, of dogs, and now there's a significant amount of breeds that are currently available where they have health problems and ailments that arise from the fact that we've artificially selected down these populations to where, though we have maybe desired phenotypes, so what they physically look like, where actually we have selected for them to have problems with their health, right? So there's some problems that have dogs that have problems with their hips. There's some dogs that have problems with their breathing because we've selected so much their noses for a particular feature. Thinking about the example of agriculture, one of the problems as well is we've narrowed down some of our plants through artificial selection to the same type of degree where we've really narrowed genetic diversity within those plants. And one thing people are concerned about is the fact that, you know, if there is a new virus that arises that targets certain plant species, and we've now genetically selected, let's say, wheat to only a few type of breeds, and now this virus is adapt to all those breeds, and we basically have no way of incorporating new plant species because we've selected them out of our breeding programs. So that's something kind of international agricultural groups are mindful of, and they keep a repository of seeds from 100 years ago or more to ensure that we do have genetic diversity available if there is a problem. So it's kind of another example that we sometimes see in biology where there's tools available that allow us to create something that's for the betterment of man, but sometimes over time we see that perhaps that wasn't necessarily the best decision, or it's something we have to be careful of. And so that's definitely something to think about in relation to artificial selection. The next thing that we're going to talk about is natural selection, but before we talk about natural selection, I just want to mention two things. So two other theories that came about before natural selection. So before the work of Darwin became well known and accepted, there were two theories in relation to evolution that we're going to mention here. So the first one is descent with modification. And so this is shown by this kind of terrible old family photo shot. This is not a family photo of mine. This is just one I found on the internet when I searched awkward family photos. But this is just showing that when you descend from your parents, the traits that you acquire from them, of course, they'll be similar. You'll look similar to your parents, but you will have a degree of modification in those observable characteristics that you have, right? So you probably look like your mom or dad, but maybe you have a slightly different nose or your chin's a little bit different. And so that's the theory of descent with modification. This is something that we can observe across most species, right? If we look at dogs, if we look very closely at the physical features they have, they'll maintain majority of the same ones from their parents, but there will be some modification. The other theory is common descent, and this is just referring to the figure in the bottom right here, and this is a simplified form of the tree of life. And so what this is showing in the branches and the leaves, if you will, of this figure, these are all the species that are currently existing or ones that were existing in the past. If we trace back those lineages, if you will, trace back those branches, they will eventually lead to a common ancestor, the root in this tree. And so what that means is we're all related to some degree to the point of that we all derive from a common ancestor. So whatever that original organism was, that single cell that was created at the beginning of time, if you will, that is our common ancestor, and we can trace all organisms back to that common ancestor. So as I mentioned, natural selection, this is the theory that Darwin put forward. And with his work, what he did is, as an evolutionary biologist, he was traveling around the world, if you will, making observations of organisms. And what he noticed in general is that when he traveled to islands, we're going to talk about the Galapagos specifically, but before that work, he noticed that when he traveled to islands, there would be unique characteristics or slight changes or deviations in animal populations compared to what would be on the mainland. So that was kind of his first kind of aha moment, that there must be something going on in relation to these populations selecting for some of these traits. And so, as most of you probably are aware of, his work was really profound in relation to the work that he did with the Galapagos Islands. And so the Galapagos Islands are a number of islands in this clustered region. And what he observed is when he traveled to all these islands, he documented all the different life forms he observed. So plants, animals, birds, amphibians, and made records of what they looked like, the physical features they had, but then he also observed them in those habitats. And what he observed specifically in relation to the turtles that are there is that these turtles had some of the same features that he observed in other environments. So across the ocean, if you look at turtles that reside in Africa or turtles that reside in South America, they have similar physiology in relation to kind of their structure and role. But specifically with the turtles he observed in the Galapagos Islands is on the individual islands themselves, the turtles had very unique structures and physical features compared to one another. Okay? And what he observed is he believed that these features, if you will, characteristics, arose from the fact that the vegetation environment was very different on the islands. Though they were close to one another, these volcanic islands did develop quite unique microhabitats, if you will, microenvironments. So, for example, the Isabella Island dome-shaped shells. This island was quite rich in vegetation, and it was had quite low grass, and this was the preferred food source of this particular turtle. And what he observed, is that because of that, the turtle was able to just easily eat the grass on that ground, and that resulted in it having a shorter neck, if you will, because it just had to lower its head in order to eat that vegetation. But what he noticed in particular with the Hood Island, those turtles had a longer neck, right? You can see that they're significantly longer from one another. And he believed this was due to the fact that on this island, it was much more of a kind of rockier landscape. It had more cactus-like type of plants, and that was the vegetation that this turtle ate. And so it needed a longer neck in order to reach up on these cacti-type structures and eat the leaves that were on the top. And so this is really profound and interesting if you think of that, how physically close these islands were one another, and yet there's these really distinct differences between these turtles. And this is where he came up with the theory of natural selection. And so this is where just naturally in nature there's a selective pressure, and in this case it's the food source, the vegetation, and that in order for these turtles to survive, they had to evolve physically in order to effectively acquire that food source. Right? The Isabella Island, the dome-shaped shells turtles, they would not have survived on Hood Island with that short neck. So the definition, if you will, of natural selection is it's traits that vary at random and may give some individuals a survival advantage over the rest of the population. Right? And so this is where we have, kind of thinking back to that example I showed with the bunny, where we have a random change in the color of those rabbits, and that example is white, and this is a survival advantage, and this is where we have a selection for that trait in that population. Right? And so thinking about natural selection, this is a particular process that favors these heritable characteristics that increase the survival of chances of organisms, right? Because if we think of in some habitats where it's quite, there's a lot of predators, it's dangerous for them, changes in traits that allow them to increase and have a greater chance of survivability, of course, will allow them to survive and then pass on to subsequent generations. Okay? And really that's what the take home with natural selection is. These heritable traits have an advantage which lead to the ability to reproduce. So you're passing on that genetic material to that next generation. And really that's the goal with all organisms in general, right? Is the ability to survive and pass on your genetic material to your offspring, right? To that next generation. So with natural selection, right, in some instances, perhaps this is where we have a divergence of a species and both of them possibly are able to survive. But a lot of times what we see is through natural selection, there will be one organism that has this change that's able to survive, and the one without that change is not able to survive. And this is where we have the selection going on. Okay, so one example that we'll show here is looking at bacteria that are resistant to certain antibiotics, and that antibiotic is the pressure that's selecting for the microorganisms that will survive. So here we have 3 different bacteria, a blue one, a green one, and a purple one. We expose this population to one type of antibiotic. After that antibiotic exposure, it kills the green bacteria, but the blue one and the purple one are able to survive, right? Then we expose those populations to a second antibiotic treatment. It kills the purple one, but now we have only the blue bacteria that are capable of surviving. And so this is where we're selecting out certain populations that result in us having this kind of uniform population of just this purple bacteria. And this is really what we're starting to see in a lot of populations right now, right, where we have over the last 50 years an overuse of antibiotics, them being prescribed and overused in agriculture, and now we're slowly killing out organisms that are naturally part of, let's say, our gut microbiota due to antibiotic exposure, and then we're selecting for these particular species that will survive, right? And again, we're talking about this in the context of bacteria. And this type of evolution, we can see this over 50 years, but with animals, thinking about the tortoises is obviously something that's happened over thousands of years, but this is an example of what we see in relation to natural selection, right? And in this example, we're talking about antibiotics, but it could be food source, it could be a change in the environment, a change in the temperature. If if we think of an asteroid hitting the Earth, all of a sudden, we're covered in dust in the air, the temperature dramatically changes, that would all of a sudden be a new selective pressure for natural selection to occur, right? So really it's some sort of change that puts pressure on a population, and only the organisms that have that trait that can survive are the ones that will thrive and exist in a population. So a term you may have heard before, survival of the fittest. What essentially this term means is what we just discussed, is that the organism that contains a trait or characteristic that leads to survivability is the one that will survive, right? This is where that simple expression comes from, survival of the fittest. So the example shown here is a giraffe, and really simply, it's believed that the original ancestor of a giraffe had a much, much shorter neck, so probably something similar to kind of a horse type of structure. And, it was competing for this type of food source on trees and vegetation with other liked species that were the same height. And so for it to survive and be the fittest, it had to evolve some sort of physical characteristic that was advantageous compared to the other animals that it was competing with for food. And so over time, over quite a few generations, its neck got longer, and of course the longer the neck it had, it was able to reach these higher vegetation, those higher food sources, and then it was out competing other organisms. So you can imagine if, you know, the one on the left, it's competing with other animals the same height, and the one on the right is what's evolved. You can see how the one on the right has a characteristic that contributes to its survival. And so that's where we have the maintenance of these characteristics due to them being an important component in their survivability under certain conditions or environments. So natural selection can occur in general by 4 different means. Okay, so one is random variations that naturally occur in every individual. And so as we talked about with descent with modification, right, this is where we just have random variations that naturally happen in an individual, right? It could be something that helps our survivability, and then we end up maintaining it and passing it on to subsequent generations. The second one is nature is a dangerous place, and survival is a constant competition to find food, avoid predators, keep warm. So this is where due to our environment, let's say an environment for a particular animal that, you know, there's pressure on it to survive, if you end up having some sort of evolutionary selection for a trait that allows you to find food better, helps you to avoid predators, keep warm, those will contribute to you surviving, and then subsequently that population will be selected to pass on to next generations. Some mutations may give an individual a survival advantage, other mutations may be a survival disadvantage, and some mutations may have no noticeable impact. So what we mean by that is when we're talking about natural selection, we're talking about ones that exist now. So if we think about the giraffe, we just talked about the giraffe, we're looking at it with this single change resulting in a longer neck. We don't really know what other characteristics may have arisen in that population over time. Perhaps there was a mutation that one had a shorter neck and shorter legs, and that was a disadvantage, and that's how that species didn't survive. There's also some selection events which we can think about now where there's some organisms that have certain traits that really we don't understand at this point why they have that, right? What is the purpose of it having that feature? We can't determine any biological purpose or advantageous component in survival. And so that's an example where we have these mutations that have no noticeable impact, okay? So then with these mutations too, this is where we have a change in the genetic code, right? So this is where we have a change in our DNA that results in us having these characteristics. As well, over time, more organisms with an advantageous trait will survive long enough to reproduce, and those without won't, right? So this is what we were talking about before, where unfortunately that's kind of the name of the game, where if you have a trait that makes you better, more fit, you will survive and the others will not. And so it's kind of interesting when you think of evolution, you know, if we think of the animal populations or plant populations we have, it's kind of interesting to think about, you know, probably the thousands, millions of organisms that have been here before but just did not survive, or, you know, didn't have the advantageous traits that allowed them to be here today. So now we're going to watch a short video on the 5 fingers of evolution. It's going to go over these 5 ways in which evolution can occur.
The 5 fingers of evolution. A thorough understanding of biology requires a thorough understanding of the process of evolution. Most people are familiar with the process of natural selection. However, this is just one of 5 processes that can result in evolution. Before we discuss all 5 of these processes, we should define evolution. Evolution is simply change in the gene pool over time. But what is a gene pool? And for that matter, what is a gene? Before spending any more time on genetics, let us begin with a story. Imagine that a boat capsizes and 10 survivors swim to shore on a deserted island. They are never rescued, and they form a new population that exists for thousands of years. Strangely enough, 5 of the survivors have red hair. Red hair is created when a person inherits 2 copies of the red gene from their parents. If you only have 1 copy of the gene, you won't have red hair. To make this easier, we will assume that the 5 non-redheads are not carriers of the gene. The initial frequency of the red hair gene is therefore 50%, or 10 of 20 total genes. These genes are the gene pool. The 20 different genes are like cards in a deck that keep getting reshuffled with each new generation. Sex is simply a reshuffling of the genetic deck. The cards are reshuffled and passed to the next generation. The deck remains the same, 50% red. The genes are reshuffled and passed to the next generation. The gene pool remains the same, 50% red. Even though the population may grow in size over time, the frequency should stay at about 50%. If this frequency ever varies, then evolution has occurred. Evolution is simply change in the gene pool over time. Think about it in terms of the cards. If the frequency of the cards in the deck ever changes, evolution has occurred. There are 5 processes that can cause the frequency to change. To remember these processes, we will use the fingers on your hand, starting from the little finger and moving to the thumb. The little finger should remind you that the population can shrink. If the population shrinks, then chance can take over. For example, if only 4 individuals survive an epidemic, then their genes will represent the new gene pool. The next finger is the ring finger. This finger should remind you of mating because a ring represents a couple. If individuals choose a mate based on their appearance or location, the frequency may change. If redheaded individuals only mate with redheaded individuals, they could eventually form a new population. If no one ever mates with redheaded individuals, these genes could decrease. The next finger is the middle finger. The M in the middle finger should remind you of the M in the word mutation. If a new gene is added through mutation, it can affect the frequency. Imagine a gene mutation creates a new color of hair. This would obviously change the frequency in the gene pool. The pointer finger should remind you of movement. If new individuals flow into an area or immigrate, the frequency will change. If individuals flow out of an area or emigrate, then the frequency will change. In science, we refer to this movement as gene flow. All 4 of the processes represented by our fingers can cause evolution. Small population size, non-random mating, mutations, and gene flow. However, none of them lead to adaptation. Natural selection is the only process that creates organisms better adapted to their local environment. I use the thumb to remember this process. Nature votes thumbs up for adaptations that will do well in their environment and thumbs down to adaptations that will do poorly. The genes for individuals that are not adapted for their environment will gradually be replaced by those that are better adapted. Red hair is an example of one of these adaptations. Red hair is an advantage in the northern climates because the fair-skinned allowed ancestors to absorb more light and synthesize more vitamin D. Thumbs up. However, this was a disadvantage in the more southern climates where increased UV radiation led to cancer and decreased fertility. Thumbs down. Even the thumb itself is an adaptation formed through the process of natural selection. The evolution that we have described is referred to as microevolution because it refers to a small change. However, this form of evolution may eventually lead to macroevolution or speciation. Every organism on the planet shares ancestry with a single common ancestor. All living organisms on the planet are connected back in time through the process of evolution. Take a look at your own hand. It's an engineering masterpiece that was created by the 5 processes I just described over millions and millions of years. Can you recall the 5 main causes of evolution from memory? If you can't, hit rewind and watch that part again. But if you can, give yourself or your neighbor a big 5-fingered high five.
So now we're going to talk about evidence of evolution, right? So of course we've talked about a couple of theories that we've drawn, evolutionary biologists have drawn conclusions from about, how we have certain organisms or how populations of animals arise. Now we're going to talk about how evolutionary biologists have come to collect evidence that impacts some of the conclusions we're drawing with evolution. Okay, so we're going to look at anatomical comparisons, embryological phylogenetic comparisons, fossils comparisons, and then DNA comparisons. So anatomical comparison, this is where you're looking at the anatomy of a particular organism and comparing it across other species. So, you know, we can look at anatomical comparisons across closely related species, or also if we're looking at a broader sense, we can look at them across different kind of kingdoms of species, where on the surface, perhaps we don't think they're closely related to one another. So this is looking at the skeletal structure of the limb. And we're looking at a comparison here with humans, horse, whale, turtle, frog, and bird, right? And we're not going to do the specifics of these observations in the skeletal system, but here it shows color coding of the different key structural components of each of these limbs. And really what observations we can draw from this is the fact that in general, they all have kind of the same overall structure, right? They all have the same 3 components. Though we have fingers and a horse doesn't quite have a finger, but we can see with a whale and a turtle, frog and a bird, you know, overall we can see that there is a common theme across these anatomical comparisons, right? Now we can look at them more closely and believe, you know, and make observations on which ones are more closely related, right? So perhaps we can look at the turtle and frog and look and see, you know what, those actually anatomically, those limbs actually look closer related to one another than the other ones. And then that would help us to believe that perhaps these species are more closely related and evolved maybe from a common ancestor compared to the other ones. So these are the type of anatomical comparisons that we can make and what biologists have made, particularly in the early stages of evolutionary biology. So let's say about 100 years ago. We can also do a comparison when we look at embryogenesis and look at the different stages in embryo across different species, right? So here in this example, we have a fish, turtle, salamander, and a human, right? And of course, it's really interesting if we look at that initial stage of an embryo across these 4 species, we can see they're actually quite closely, they kind of look closely related to one another, which is, you know, an interesting observation. But of course, as we see this embryo moving through these stages into a fetus, we can see that there is more complex biological processes happening, and we can see with the human, for example, how it's a much more complex organism compared to the other species. But again, this is where we can see that there perhaps is a more relatability to certain species compared to others. So of course, with the fish and salamander, we can see that they look more closely related through the different stages of embryogenesis. And we can draw observations that perhaps they're closer related and again have perhaps a closer related common ancestor compared to these other organisms. Fossil comparisons, we briefly spoke about this in the context of the horse fossils, but again, this is where we start to understand more closely how species evolved over time, right? So if we look at humans, this is fossil comparisons of skulls that have been found. So archaeologists examine these skulls with evolutionary biologists, and they're able to draw conclusions as to how different structural components evolved, which led to, you know, a larger brain, and then this led to why certain species like Homo sapiens that are us today are present, and some of these other organisms didn't survive, right? And this is where, you know, we can see back that we have this common ancestor, and we have some of those common physical traits, but overall the evolution to the structure we see today with our skull represents some sort of advantage trait, which is our larger brain. And then DNA comparison, this is where we extract DNA from a particular species, and it can be one that's present now, but you know, when they find fossils nowadays, one of the first things they do is they see if there's any intact DNA that's been preserved. So we can also compare DNA to you know, species that were present thousands of years ago. But really simply what this figure is showing is if we analyze a region of the DNA, so it could be a particular gene or just a region of DNA, and here what we see is blue is where we have commonalities, and gray is where there's some sort of difference or a lack of similar DNA there. So if we look at this genetic code, what we can see is the aligned sequencing and gaps. We can see there's quite a bit of similarity between human and chimpanzees. Orangutans, though there is some aligned, there is some differences where that gap is. And what we can see here when we look at the DNA comparison is we can, quite easily determine how closely related species are. And this is actually probably the most common approach used by evolutionary biologists to understand relatedness between particular organisms. And so with this, we can build out very specific lineages that allow us to see how closely related species are, right? So we're more closely related to chimpanzees than we are to orangutans. And now we can actually look down to the genetic code and understand what particular genetic code differences relate to perhaps some of those physiological differences we see. And this is where we now can predict to some degree where we believe, this organism, we're not sure at point in time, but this organism had a mutation in this gene, and that mutation in the gene resulted in a change in their evolutionary relatedness. So perhaps the gorilla at some point had some sort of mutation. Perhaps it's in this region here. And that mutation all of a sudden resulted in significant difference in its biology and its structure, and that's why we see differences to this day. But it's interesting to think, I think humans and chimpanzees are like 99% related on the DNA level, which is, quite high. I mean, I think humans are like 80% related to worms, so take that with a bit of grain of salt, if you will, but we're highly related to chimpanzees, but obviously the intelligence and evolution is so different from one another. So it's interesting to think what event happened right here in that, splitting of humans and chimps that relate in the difference of those species. So what comes to mind when you think of mass extinctions? We're going to talk about that a little bit. I have a video that we'll watch in a moment. But the definition of mass extinction, this is where we have widespread and rapid decrease in the biodiversity on Earth. So if we think of Earth right now, we're a very, very biodiverse planet. But an extinction event is where there's some event that occurs that all of a sudden results in a significant decrease or a very strong, sharp change in the diversity and abundance of multicellular organisms. So now we're going to watch a short video that looks at mass extinctions and what those mean over time in relation to evolution.
In the 1970s, a scientist named Jack Sepkoski embarked on the most ambitious fossil hunt ever. But instead of digging in the dirt, he dug through dusty piles of academic research and scraped together a record of all the ocean-dwelling creatures known to science. It was tedious work, but the data it yielded gave rise to perhaps the most famous chart in paleontology, a tally of marine life over time that revealed 5 catastrophic global biodiversity crashes in Earth's past. Those crashes, known as the Big 5 mass extinctions, are commonly believed to have been the biggest die-offs in Earth's history, both in and out of the oceans. They include that time 66 million years ago when a huge meteorite took out the non-avian dinosaurs, as well as the even more apocalyptic extinction at the end of the Permian period, which wiped out more than 90% of Earth's species. But the Big 5 weren't the only big mass extinctions, and they might not have even been the biggest. Take the Great Oxygenation Event of 2.3 billion years ago. Evidence from ancient rocks tells us that levels of atmospheric oxygen spiked around this time, poisoning the oxygen-hating microbes that had dominated Earth for well over 1 billion years. And yet, we can't really say how that extinction compares to the Big Five, because its victims were microscopic and left virtually no signature in the fossil record. In fact, the fossil record only captures a tiny fraction of the life that has ever existed on our planet, but it also captures a different fraction from one period to the next. In general, the record gets less and less complete the further back in time you go, but that trend is complicated by several other factors. For one, we have a lot more fossils from swampy places and periods of the past, not necessarily because those periods were more diverse, but because the calm, muddy conditions were perfect for preservation. We also have a lot more rock from some periods of time than others, and in general, the more rock we have, the more fossils we find, and the more abundant life appears to have been. In other words, the fossil record is inconsistent, so we can't just tally the number of species and take the results at face value, as Sapkowski's Big Five chart did. But paleontologists have used some clever statistics to adjust for those inconsistencies, and the latest diversity curve makes it look like there have been 8 major mass extinctions rather than 5. But you could also count 11, or just narrow the list to the 3 most massive. In short, it's pretty arbitrary. What isn't arbitrary is that some mass extinctions alter the evolutionary tree of life far more radically than others. For example, the first of the Big Five pruned away more than 80% of the species on Earth, but it left all the big branches of the tree intact, so life went on more or less as it had before. Other mass extinctions, even some smaller ones like the one 66 million years ago, trimmed the evolutionary tree far less evenly, decimating some previously thriving branches and preparing others for world domination.
So that video spoke about 5 mass extinctions, and of course there's also the mention of the fact that the current theory, but it's not necessarily fully supported, is that there's been 5 mass extinctions, but of course we can look deeper at that and believe that there may be 8 and there may be 20, but these are events that are believed to have occurred where there was some dramatic change in the environment of the planet, and then this resulted in a significant decrease of majority of the organisms present on the planet at that given time. Okay, so looking at those 5 mass extinctions a little bit closer, the first one, the Ordovician-Silurian extinction, this is the major cause is believed to be a massive glaciation, and sea levels were dropping. And so what populations impacted at this point, weren't highly developed at this point, but these were where we had brachiopods, trilobites, graptolites, and various moss animals. The next extinction event, late Devonian extinction, this is where there was some evolution in the composition of the planet, and this changed the composition of the gas on the planet, the gaseous states, and then this resulted in large populations of kind of tropical, so coral, sponge, any fish that were present. The third one, Permian-Triassic extinction, this is where there was an unstable climate as well. They believed it could have been an asteroid impact, and then this resulted in, fairly large depletion of, they believed at that point, marine invertebrates and aquatic type of organisms, but as well any life that was present. The fourth one, Triassic-Jurassic extinction, this is where there was significant change in the climate. They believe there could have been high temperatures, a lot of volcanic eruptions, so increase in certain gases that were toxic. This is where we had extinction of large amphibians, so kind of predecessors to dinosaurs. But interestingly, this is where we have crocodiles that are capable of surviving this particular extinction event. And then Cretaceous extinction event, this is again where we have believed to be an asteroid impact, and they believe they know the specific crater that where this event occurred, and this is where we had a large loss of most organisms, and this is where we have the loss of these dinosaur type of structures. And so looking at these extinction events, it's interesting to think of when will be the next mass extinction. Of course, people who follow climate change, and some people who are perhaps alarmists believe that we're due for the 6th one. So it's interesting to think about what you can do to avoid these mass extinctions. If we look at these organisms that were impacted during these 5 extinction events, They weren't very evolved organisms, thinking of humans. So, do we have the means to perhaps avoid one of these events if our climate was to significantly change? Okay, so I wanted to finish with 5 questions that I wanted you to think about. So, you can maybe jot these down or pause the video and think about each of them as we go through them. I won't be answering them, but they're more just kind of unanswered questions that I want you to think about in regards to evolution, now that we've gone through a bit of evolutionary biology. So the first is, what do we still not understand about evolution? Of course, we only kind of discussed this in this short time period. Evolutionary biology is something you can take as a degree, so you can study this for many years. But still, thinking about the few topics we did talk about today, what are some things that are still not clear? Where do you think, evolutionary biologists need to continue to explore? The second question is, how quickly do these evolutionary events occur? As I mentioned, now we can predict to some degree with some of the technology we have to kind of make assumptions or predictions on how quickly these events occur, but really we don't know that definitively. So it's interesting to see some of these organisms that have evolved over time, but still not quite certain as to how rapid those processes occur. The third is, how reliant can we be on fossil records? Right? If we look at fossil records, they believe that this is just touching the surface of the organisms that have existed. Right? If we think of how many dinosaur fossils have been found to date, that really does not reflect by any means the number of dinosaurs that were present on the planet over time, of course, right? So, when we find fossils, we tend to find them in particular environments where believed to have been in a state that was ideal for their preservation. So organisms that thrived in a kind of a muddy environment, opposed to ones that are in kind of unfavorable conditions for fossils. We wouldn't find those organisms. So how reliant can we be on building this tree of life and tracing it back to this common ancestor when we're just kind of picking randomly these organisms that are found with fossils, right? It's not a true capture of evolution over time. 4, we still do not understand the origin of life. So as I said, evolutionary biology does not answer that question. It only tells us kind of what comes after the fact. So what is the origin of life? How did that arise? What was the ideal conditions to that? And what are those specific steps that are involved in that process? And then the final question is, what can we do with this information? Right now, one of the hot topics is space exploration and finding life on other planets. But I think it's important to consider, what was our planet like when life all of a sudden arose? And what was our planet like during these important evolutionary events that allowed certain species to evolve? How did we as humans that are highly evolved, complex organisms, how are we thriving today? What conditions over time led to those perfect events, evolutionary speaking, that created natural selection that led to us? Do those conditions exist on another planet? Will we even find a planet in that slim piece of time where we find another organism that's highly evolved like ourselves? So with that, I just wanted to say thank you, and I hope in this short webinar you're able to pique your interest a little bit in evolutionary biology and bring forward your curiosity on this topic, and you can maybe explore this a little bit. There's some additional videos related to this topic, as well as a science fiction reading that gives you a bit of insight into what our future evolution looks like as humans, right? Kind of thinking of like the Terminator and artificial intelligence. I mean, artificial intelligence is part of our life to this day, but what happens as we evolved and that technology evolves? What does that mean for humans in our future? So with that, thank you for watching. I hope you learned something, and stay safe.
Thank you so much, Marcy, for your lecture. Marcy, as she mentioned, has provided some additional materials that you may wish to review following this lecture to further your learning. These materials have been provided on the course webpage. We know that learning has and always will be a social activity, so we encourage you to share this lecture with friends and family to discuss what you have learned today. Thank you for joining us.